The Adeptus Astartes, also known more informally as Space Marines, are genetically enhanced transhuman super soldiers which are larger, stronger, faster, and more durable than a typical human. In addition to being physically superior to baseline humans, the average Space Marine boasts enhanced reflexes and incredible mental capabilities, allowing their minds to process multiple sources of information simultaneously and react accordingly, both on and off the battlefield. As well as this, an Astartes warrior is also capable of performing various superhuman feats, such as operating for weeks at a time without sleep, spitting an acidic saliva, and even mimetically absorbing the memories of the dead by eating their flesh. The reasoning for this is due to the various genetic implants and bouts of psychological reconditioning that a Space Marine receives during their creation, as an aspirant Astartes will, over the course of several years, receive anywhere between 19 to 22 such organ implants, depending upon whether they are destined to become a firstborn or Primaris Marine. However, due to various factors such as genetic degradation or mutation, some Space Marine gene lines, such as those derived from Imperial Fist or Raven Guard stock, will have a number of their implants fail to function as intended, resulting in certain organs becoming overly active, underactive, or even missing from their genetic code entirely. Of the 9 Loyalist Legions, who would later become known within official records as the First Founding Chapters, it would be the Ultramarines who would boast the purest and most stable gene seed stocks, being closely followed by that of the Dark Angels. As a result, the Ultramarines would go on to spawn the single greatest number of successor chapters, with an estimated 60 to 75% of all Space Marine chapters prior to the events of the Ultima founding being born of their gene line. In total, 1,000 chapters of the Adeptus Astartes are said to exist, with each chapter, as dictated by the terms of the Codex Astartes, being comprised of 1,000 warriors, 1,000,000 angels of death who stand ready to unleash their wrath upon the enemies of man. But while the physical and psychological augmentations that Space Marines receive makes them, in a sense, more than human, it could be argued that such beings are simultaneously less than human due to them supposedly lacking an ability that is inherent to much of the human race: the ability to both copulate and procreate. But is there any truth to such claims? Are the warriors of the Adeptus Astartes truly unable to engage in, for want of a better term, carnal acts? Initially, it would be fairly reasonable to assume that Space Marines are, at the very least, sterile, for if the Astartes were to ever mate and reproduce, then this could eventually lead towards irreversible corruption within the human gene pool, due to the various and, in some cases, extreme flaws and mutations which are exhibited by certain chapters. As such, it's likely that the Astartes were themselves originally designed with certain biological safeguards in mind, in order to prevent such an act from ever occurring. Indeed, according to Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno, the Space Marines of what was then known as the Legione Astartes, as well as the warriors of the Legio Custodes, the personal bodyguards of the Emperor himself, are heavily implied, if not outright stated, to be both physically and psychologically incapable of engaging in any sort of sexual activity, as detailed with the following passage.
Both are subject to extensive psychological and cognitive conditioning, and are physically and mentally reworked to render most of their baser drives inert, and their beings rechanneled towards aggression, goal acquisition, and the fulfillment of duty. And as a further safeguard against distraction and as a biological control, both are, of course, incapable of procreation.
Despite this, however, there are a number of sources that appear to insinuate that, at least in the 41st millennium, certain Space Marines are not only capable of displaying libidinous urges, but may even be sexually active to a certain degree. For example, within the tale of the Silver Knight of Slaanesh, as detailed within the 8th edition Demon's Codex, the titular knight, who was outright stated to be an Astartes, was shown to have retained at least some remnant of a sex drive, and could, in theory at least, potentially succumb to his more basal and primal urges should the temptation to do so prove overwhelming, as detailed with the following passage.
The faces and fertile forms of the dancers were impossibly sensual, moulded to the perfect desire of the heart. The knight held his breath and closed his eyes, for though mortal pleasures were forbidden to his order, part of him was still a man. The crooning nymphs gathered around the knight, stroking his silvered armor and whispering of the sweet, carnal pleasures they would give him. But he yielded not.
Because of the wording used in this passage, in where it stated that the pleasures of the flesh were merely forbidden to the knight's order as opposed to being an out-and-out impossibility, this would appear to imply that an Astartes is still physically capable of engaging in sexual intercourse, even if only in a recreational, non-reproductive capacity. This idea is further supported by the existence of an Astartes who was famous, if not infamous, for his sexual escapades, a warrior of the Space Wolves chapter known as Lukas the Trickster. Prior to undergoing the gene seed implantation process, the surgical procedure which transforms a baseline human into an Astartes, Lukas was famous amongst his peers for bedding over a dozen women in a single night, resulting in him siring numerous bastards. However, Lukas's reputation as a, to put it mildly, lascivious individual does not appear to end there, for within the novel Lukas the Trickster, Lukas himself appears to insinuate that he has formed a sexual relationship with a rogue trader, who would often lavish the Space Marine with various gifts in exchange for his services, as shown with the following quote.
A hollow flash projects a sort of hololithic mask over whoever's holding it. Doesn't last long, only a few moments, then it burns out. I got them from a trader of my acquaintance. She brings me all sorts of gifts in return for certain favors.
Now admittedly, it is entirely possible that Lukas's comments regarding the favors he performs may not be sexual in nature, but could instead refer to a number of his other talents, such as fighting, tracking, infiltration, or even his penchant for playing practical jokes. But given the descriptive language used in the book, in where Lukas is stated to be grinning whilst emphasizing the words certain favors, this would appear to imply that his comments are indeed intended to be some sort of sexual innuendo. So if Space Marines and the Emperor's own Custodian Guard was stated to have been altered on both a physical and psychological level to render such urges inert, how is it possible that certain individuals, such as Lukas, are seemingly able to engage in these sorts of carnal acts? The reasoning for this may be due to a multitude of different factors. One such factor may be attributable to potential genetic degradation occurring within a chapter's gene seed, which could in turn render any countermeasures designed to inhibit an Astartes' ability to copulate becoming less effective over time, or even result in them being absent altogether. After all, as mentioned earlier, the gene seed of some chapters, such as the Raven Guard and Imperial Fists, has over time lost the ability to produce certain organs, such as the Susan membrane in the case of the Imperial Fists and mucranoid organ in that of the Raven Guard. The Space Wolves in particular were also noted for having an extremely unstable gene seed, which not only produces a number of physical mutations, such as yellow eyes and continuously growing canine fangs, but would in itself become biologically incompatible with anyone not born of the chapter's homeworld of Fenris, a trait which, prior to the onset of the Ultima founding, made the creation of Space Wolf successor chapters a complete and total impossibility. As such, it's not entirely unreasonable to assume that any latent degradation or mutation within a chapter's gene seed stocks, no matter how minor it may initially seem, could potentially result in Space Marines becoming more sexually active over time, even if they do indeed remain sterile and incapable of reproduction. The other key factor that could determine whether or not an Astartes is able to engage in copulative acts lies within the mental reconditioning processes that aspirant Space Marines are forced to undergo upon being inducted into their respective chapters. While all chapters will subject their aspirants to some form of cognitive restructuring, as such procedures are required in order to have some of the new organs function as intended, some chapters will go to greater extremes than others when it comes to a neophyte's cultural indoctrination. Because of this, if a chapter has a culture that is, for want of a better term, more boisterous and wild compared to those of other, more monastic or religious chapters, then this could, in theory, result in an Astartes' more basal instincts not being buried or repressed to the same degree, allowing them a chance to satiate such urges should they be given the chance to do so. Ultimately, it would appear that, at the very least, some Space Marine chapters are indeed physically capable of copulation, but either lack the time or motivation to participate in such acts, or simply choose not to do so for cultural or spiritual reasons. In either case, the main priority for an Astartes warrior is to perform their duty to both the Emperor and the Imperium, and as such, few of these transhuman warriors are likely to ever allow themselves to be distracted by the primitive, salacious desires of mortals. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.